Now, the situation between Nigeria and the United States remains tense following President Trump's threat of military action against Nigeria over the alleged persecution of Christians. Both countries have been engaging in diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. The Tinubu administration has hinted at a possible meeting with White House officials to discuss bilateral relations and address concerns, but there's been no confirmation of this from the American government. The Nigerians say they've asked the U.S. for assistance in fighting terrorism, and Nigeria's army chief has vowed to crush the insurgents, promising renewed efforts to end the 16-year insurgency. Both China and the EU have pledged support for Nigeria and have called for its territorial integrity to be respected. But analysts say confronting the US with verbal support from China, the EU and Russia will not do Nigeria any favors. Meanwhile, in an exclusive interview with Arise News, a US Congressman, Bill Huizenga, who's been a leading supporter of President Trump's designation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern, wants to draw the line at economic sanctions and says he does not support any military action against Nigeria. Arise correspondent Anieze Osakwe reports from Washington.
I'm here at Rayburn House, which is the office building for the U.S. House of Representatives. Because of the government shutdown, it hasn't been easy getting a hold of anyone, but we did manage to get an interview with Congressman Bill Huizenga. Let's see what he has to say about these allegations of a Christian genocide in Nigeria.
I'm glad that we're able to do this. This is something that's been very, very important, and as I've been saying to some of my colleagues, we were too late on Rwanda. We were too late on South Sudan and a number of other atrocities that have happened in Africa and other places around the world. So let's not be too late again on this one. What I'm concerned about in particular is you look at the Fulani and the radicalized Islamists, how they are attacking both moderate Muslims as well as the Christians. And I think it's hard to deny when you see 200 Christians slaughtered on Christmas Eve a few years ago. Clearly it was coordinated in the attack. And I've talked to people that were in the village. I've talked to religious leaders who have been experiencing this for years. They feel targeted and know that when their homes are being entered or they're being attacked in the middle of the night, this is not just some sort of, people are in conflict. They feel very much targeted.
Because of that, the U.S. response has been swift.
Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria.
President Trump threatening to potentially go into the country, guns blazing, to wipe out Islamic terrorists.
I too was surprised by the comments that they came out, that the president came out that forcefully. I suspect that is not a high priority of having actual military intervention specifically in Nigeria, but I think he does want to make sure that from his view, the genocide that is happening specifically against Christians, but also others in Nigeria, needs to stop.
But instead of military strikes, Congressman Huizenga now calling for economic sanctions.
Well, I don't envision a surprise attack. I don't envision that there's going to be a military response first. As we had talked about, I would first and foremost encourage them to look at the economic pressure and sanctions on both individuals and organizations. I think that would be the most effective. Frankly, this president has been someone who has pursued peace rather than just expanding war. So I think he would be very selective before he did anything militarily. As we talked a little bit about earlier, with our government shutdown here in the United States over the last 40 plus days, that has caused some real problems for us internally. And we are having to deal with that. So first and foremost, our attention is going to be on reopening our government, trying to get it back and functioning at maximum level. That doesn't mean we stop talking about or thinking about or acting on all of these other issues, but there will probably be more of an emphasis on our government operations initially here for the next couple of weeks. then with our appropriations bills and the things that are going on. I mean, one of the ramifications is we aren't able to have committee hearings right now. So that's one of the ways that we help try to raise the attention on these particular issues. So we need to get back to having the government open so we can start having those hearings again, and those kinds of things. Sanctions really cut off the flow of money, cut off the flow of travel. We don't know who exactly is financing much of these operations from the Fulani or Boko Haram in the past. And what I do know is, though, if we put economic pressure on them and the inability to move money around, that will have an impact, I think a positive impact. So I want to get serious about it because, again, I'm not convinced that the Nigerian government has taken the situation seriously.
And that's Congressman Bill Huizenga ending that report by Arise correspondent Anyeze Osakwe. And Anyeze joins me now on the line from Washington, D.C. Very interesting report there, and also really very good to get his perspective. Just tell us more about Congressman Bill Huizenga and what his interest might be with Nigeria. I mean, he's been quite vocal about this country, hasn't he? Expressing sort of voluble disappointment with the government's handling of alleged attacks on Christians, but calling for economic sanctions rather than military action.
That's exactly what he said, Charles. And, you know, in my conversation with him, he basically told me about how this issue to him, yes, is political, as he is someone on the Africa subcommittee, but it's also personal. You know, the congressman is part of a church called the Christian Reformed Church, and it actually has deep links with Nigeria for the past 100 years because missionaries from the U.S. had been going to Nigeria through this church and had been essentially working in places like Benue and Jos, so they know the country deeply. He even said that there's more African members of this Christian Reformed Church than Americans, and made a joke that it's an African church that's headquartered in Michigan. And beyond that, I know that he said his sister has been to Nigeria and his wife as well on what I believe were mission trips. So there are a lot of people close to him that have a knowledge and an understanding of what he said was this Christian genocide in Nigeria because they've witnessed it firsthand and they've come back to tell him about it as well. And to your point, yes, he's all about economic sanctions. I mean, for him, like he said in that interview and we heard, he was shocked that President Trump even made that statement of a potential military intervention in the first place, because for him, President Trump was or is a president of peace, and economic sanctions are really where you can hit officials where it hurts, you know, by restricting their travel, by restricting their ability to actually access money. All of these things he thinks should be plan A before any kind of military intervention is put into place. So yeah, economic sanctions for him are absolutely the name of the game.
And he's been sort of responding to China, Russia, and the EU with regard to their suggestion that Nigeria's sovereignty should be respected. Just tell us a bit about that briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very briefly, we know that when Trump made those comments about a possible military intervention into Nigeria, a lot of people's response, including the Nigerian government's response, was the fact that Nigeria's sovereignty needs to be maintained. We're an independent country. And so after that, we had a lot of responses from, you know, the EU ambassador to ECOWAS in Nigeria. And we also heard from China, the Chinese ambassador to Nigeria, and I quote in a post on X, that we oppose any country's interference in other countries' internal affairs under the pretext of religion and human rights. And Russia said something similar. They said that they were monitoring the situation after President Trump made those comments, and that, you know, country's sovereignty should be respected. And for the congressman, he literally said that their comments drip with irony, because when you look at the incursions that China is doing in the South China Sea and in a number of Southeastern Asian countries, as well as Russia, when you look at a chunk of Georgia being under Russian control, as well as a good chunk of eastern Ukraine, he said that, okay, these countries are making these comments, but they're not really in a position to talk about sovereignty when they themselves are kind of pushing forward on other countries' sovereignties as well. So that was an interesting reaction to Russia and China from him.
Absolutely. And Congressman Heisinger also highlighted the need for Nigeria to address the root causes of violence and to protect all its citizens regardless of faith. I mean, that rather echoes what most Nigerians are saying, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, Charles, and I'm glad you brought this up because something that we have even talked about on your show before is how a lot of people feel like if President Trump and America hadn't brought this issue that a lot of Nigerians have been living with, have been talking about with for decades, if the U.S. hadn't essentially brought it to the fore, it wouldn't have gotten the global attention and recognition that it's currently getting. And when we look at the relationship between Nigerians living in Nigeria and the U.S., what's interesting is that Nigeria actually has a very strong pro-Trump sentiment. There was a Pew Research poll done earlier this year that found that 79% of Nigerians in Nigeria had high confidence in America's president to do the right thing when it comes to global affairs. So I think that that number is really interesting to highlight because the sentiment for a lot of Nigerians in Nigeria is that they do support what President Trump does and says, and this is just another example of that for a sizable population in the country.
And would it be fair to say, Anieze, that one of the things that really stand out in his efforts is his determination to hold accountable those responsible for violence in Nigeria?
Absolutely. I mean, so much of our conversation was based on the fact that economic sanctions are what he wants to do, or what he wants to put in place for Nigerian officials to kind of recognize that this is an issue. And I think that an interesting point that he made was the fact that despite him calling out Nigerian government officials and in spite of him saying that they aren't doing enough and that they're not taking the situation seriously enough, he also seems to hold Nigeria in high regard. You know, he talked about it as an economic powerhouse, as a cultural powerhouse as well. And he even said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, but for West Africa and Africa to flourish, Nigeria specifically has to flourish. And I think that this dichotomy between wanting Nigerian government officials to essentially do better is kind of, you know, juxtaposed with his ability to see Nigeria for the potential and for what it could be. And that's something that he really wanted to emphasize, that he sees so much potential in Nigeria vis-a-vis President Trump, who called, you know, Nigeria a just now disgraced country.
And Anieze, I know you've got to run in a minute because you've got things you have to attend to, but where do things stand just now with regard to Nigeria's diplomacy with the US over this issue? Have the Nigerians made any breakthroughs that you're aware of?
So, you know, we know that the Nigerian government, President Tinubu, as well as the Information Minister Mohammed Idris, have said that they're going to engage with the world diplomatically on this, and it appears to be that that's what they're doing. Mohammed Idris, the Information Minister, just did an interview with Sky News on Monday evening, where he said that, you know, diplomatic efforts between Nigeria and the US are yielding results. So that seems to imply or suggest that Nigeria and the US are currently engaged in diplomatic talks and conversations. That's also something that Congressman Heisinger said, that, you know, if Nigerian officials want to come to Washington, D.C., the door is open. He's willing to meet with them. He's ready to meet with them. So there is a willingness on the part of the U.S. to receive Nigerian government officials. We are still waiting for that list of ambassadors that the Nigerian government said that they would put out, because I think that whoever steps into that role will be in a key position to negotiate through these challenges and work through this new relationship that we're trying to establish with the U.S. But yes, it seems that at least talks have begun. We'll keep our eyes open for if a meeting or a phone call take place as well. But that's where things stand.
Okay, Anieze, thank you very much indeed, and thanks for bringing us that exclusive interview. Anieze Osakwe is a RISE correspondent. She was talking to me on the line there from Washington.